The Boys is a 2019 Amazon Prime superhero show. It's a comic adaptation of Garth Ennis' works. It's really a subversion take on the Justice League, meaning like, what if the Justice League was a bunch of murderous jerks run by evil capitalists? And we focus on a group of people known as the Boys, people who have been harmed by these superheroes by one way or another, who decide to hunt them down and stop the evil company controlling them, VOT. The show is really popular and one of the rarities in our current streaming age to last more than 2 seasons, being given a 5 season deal with multiple spin-offs, 2 already airing and being well received. Gen V, the spin-off show that's set in college, and the anthology series, The Boys Diabolical. That was animated and it was amazing. And for the most part, The Boys is a pretty solid show. It's not perfect. It's really flawed in a lot of ways, especially with season 4. But what show is completely without flaw? It's got a great ensemble cast of characters, solid actors, fun storylines, solid effects, and they even got Carl Urban showing tits, so there's something there for everybody. But as of late, there's been a bit of backlash by conservatives because they think the show is being too biased against right-wingers by lambasting their ideology. Now, if you have watched the show from season 1, it's been very obvious that the show was against conservative ideology, which is what leftists like myself have been saying and commenting on, and it's been brought up multiple times before. Like, why did conservatives love The Boys when it was making fun of them? And I actually have a couple of theories as to why, and I'm going to list a few from the most obvious observations and delve deeper into what I feel drew conservatives to the show, because I feel like what my peers have missed a few key parts of this analysis as to why conservatives loved The Boys so much. Starting with the obvious, when conservatives talk about The Boys show, especially in its earlier seasons, why it was enjoyable to them, they talk about how the show made fun of everybody. When conservatives say that the show was making fun of people to the left of them, you see it in the scenes where they're at Bot Disneyland, and they use social movements like BLM and LGBT acceptance as a tool of marketing. It's making fun of the co-opting of movements, while the show itself supports LGBT characters like Maeve and her struggle with her sexuality being used against her from Homelander as a form of torment because he can no longer have her. And how the show takes time to discuss how there are Black characters who face racism within the superhero system and as civilians like A-Train and Marvin's Mill. Meanwhile, the hatred toward conservatives is more rooted in their ideology, seeing the things that push people to become more radicalized via conservatism and via the dog whistles that push people to act out things like stochastic terrorism, things like, white supremacy or bigotry. And you see that, and that's more rooted in the actual ideology of conservatives, this idea of like who is viewed as more like genetically superior for whatever arbitrary reason because you think it would benefit you somehow. That is a concept that is rooted in white conservative ideology in America, and you can see it reflected within the show and the way that they present Homelander and characters like Stormfront. And that leads me to So Homelander is this blue-eyed blonde man with superpowers, and he is an antagonist of the show, like aggressively so, like very obviously so. But conservatives have latched onto him. Why? It's because he's been given a lot of focus and has power. We can talk about the type of person that Anthony Starr is in real life, but just examining him as an actor has been giving a very charismatic performance as Homelander, in which he goes through being this terrible powerhouse killer to a pathetic little worm of a man who has nothing because he denies meeting the humanity of other people around him. And for conservatives, the fact that he's a sexual assailant or a killer and the obvious bad guy doesn't mean anything. What matters is that he's an attractive blonde man with power. The only thing that matters is the aesthetic, and Homelander fits the aesthetic of what conservatives often see themselves as: powerful, chosen people who are not allowed to do what they want, should be able to, and they should have the power to do so, carte blanche. This is how you get a popular conservative commentator like Lauren Chen comparing Homelander to Trump in a positive manner.
It's meant to be an insult to Trump, but simultaneously, the show portrays him, Homelander, as kind of awesome.
Conservatives see interesting characters and recuperate them into their own politics, like Homelander being so memeable and popular on the internet is a way for conservatives to recuperate the image of this conservative evil character into someone conservatives to aspire to. Like, look at how fun and silly and strong and relatable Homelander is. And this character thinks he should be able to do whatever he wants and that he's at the top of the social hierarchy, just like, or at least he thinks that he's just like me for real. The show is giving Homelander depth like any good writer would do, and because Anthony Starr has such a charismatic performance, he's kind of become like a marketing from fan reaction means to plain old promos to watch the show, and has been confused with Homelander being the true protagonist and a character we should root for when it's just solid character writing explaining the actions of our antagonist and giving him humanity so that we as an audience know we are capable of the same evil while being shown his foils. Take, for example, in season 4, episode 4, the episode where Homelander goes back to where he was raised and torments the people who abused him growing up, leading up to this scene where he offs them all. In contrast, Kimiko, choosing to spare her own enemy who was actively attacking her, who also has history with her. Kimiko was also traumatized and arguably treated worse than Homelander as a child, yet chooses compassion and mercy for her enemy, where Homelander chooses senseless, cruel slaughter for his. We're meant to see the parallels in how it is possible for someone to have experienced terrible harm yet choose to become a better person, even though it is difficult and even though it is through their own trauma. That the show is very intentional that Homelander is not meant to be the end-all be-all character that we root for with the boys as a whole. Like, very, very obvious. Something that I think has been left out of this conversation is how conservatives view liberals and liberal art. You'll find the answers lurking in modern conservative media if you've ever seen conservative skits or whatever the hell the Daily Wire is releasing now that they call entertainment. You'll find countless examples of anyone who is left of conservatism as a softie who is more concerned with proper pronoun usage, the representational optics, and making the softest story possible free of any conflict or vulgarity. Essentially, in the mind of conservatives, they think that liberals and everybody to the left of them are these two bears from Duckman.
You know, see how you're thinking. Suppose you're the chairman of a large...
Chairperson!
Suppose you're the chairperson of a large corporation that makes meat on a stick.
Oh, Mr. Duckman, we couldn't support the killing of animals for food, nor the senseless slaughter of trees for sticks.
Okay. You're the chairpeople of a large, environmentally friendly corporation that produces wholesome apples. Now, you're supposed to prove that someone died of natural causes. What would you do?
Are the apples free range or are they grown in captivity?
So when it turns out that a show has explicit dicks and tits and cursing up a storm, people confuse that vulgarity with being more real, aka telling it like it is, and being against PC culture, when you can do all that stuff and still be a more left-leaning piece of media. The fact that The Boys has violence and cursing is what makes it seem like it has the trappings of a more conservative-leaning piece of art, which leads me to... This point is really why I wanted to make this video, because even though I think we don't talk about enough about how action shows or media produced in America for American audience can reinforce conservative worldviews, I'm going to give you an example. Imagine a cowboy. I will give you a moment. Okay, moment over. You imagined the cowboy, right? Now, when you imagined the cowboy, what did he look like? Did you picture someone like John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, or somebody who looks like this? And if you pictured the first two, this is a result of conservative racism in the media. In real life, the majority of cowboys were Black and Latino and Native American. The only reason why cowboys are so overly represented and became the face of cowboydom is because of the racist conservative views that limited Hollywood from casting people of color back when the cowboy genre was big in the 50s and 60s. And even in the present day when we get to do Western stories, the cowboys, the majority of the time, are still white despite that being inaccurate. My point being that Westerns were tied in with action back in the day, and because of the bias of the people making the art of that time, it affected the perception of the world that we have now, and it's given us this falsehood. So I don't blame anybody who imagined the white cowboy. If you don't do research on this on your own, that's what you're gonna think about. And that's something you see in the present, the perceptions of the action genre. Take, for example, many action movies or crime show dramas with action and suspense sprinkled in tend to be about cops or the military. You get countless stories about the rogue cop who doesn't follow the rules and how there's too many rules holding the cops down from doing their darn job, and that asking for a lawyer makes you guilty, or how we need the military to be in foreign countries stopping the savage natives and saving the innocent people from their own countries and their own governments from themselves, or some bullshit. These narratives are often being shown to people who don't experience the negative effects of the cops or the military in real life as often, so it doesn't have as much of an effect on them. So the only thing that they really see is the propaganda, and the propaganda starts to work for them. Darnell Hunt, the media director of Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA, said, "We're pretty confident that the more TV you watch, the more media you consume, the more likely it is that the media, almost like radiation, builds up, and the accumulative effect is to make you feel what you're seeing is somewhat normal." This notion is supported by Anna Christian Ramon, the assistant director of the Bunche Center. What you see often becomes part of your memory and thus a part of your life experience. So that sort of reflects in that. So in that way, media becomes a tool to normalize ideas within a culture. You get it pretty bad with superhero movies especially. Take stuff like Man of Steel and Captain Marvel. being used to sell the military and military recruitment ads. The first Iron Man movie is about how a weapons dealer who learns the error of his ways because the leopards came to eat his face too, while making a cool suit weapon to battle off nameless Middle Eastern enemies, while the only good Middle Eastern character is a guy who speaks English and is more Western presenting. And that's just how the MCU starts. That being said, I think what really proves what I'm talking about is how much the superhero genre in its adaptations has been about protecting the status quo. And I think a good example of this are both Black Panther movies. These films are as left as the MCU can actively get while still having to be big budget blockbusters that are massive crowd pleasers meant to gather a large diverse range of audience members and to cater to multiple groups with different political views. In both films, we functionally see antagonists who will go against the status quo. You have Killmonger, who wants to start a war, basically end Western imperialism. But just so that we know he is a bad guy for wanting to do that, he kills his girlfriend just so that the audience understands we're not supposed to like him and his ideology about wanting to end the Western imperialism and get a different system and end that status quo. A similar thing happens with Namor in the second film. He doesn't want his people to be colonized again by the West, so he attacks the Wakandans, who are honestly not really their enemy, when the only people who he would actually be beefing with are Western colonial powers trying to colonize his people's land. Both films pay lip service to the historical oppression that marginalized people have faced while making sure the status quo is never too shaken up. At the end of Black Panther 1, we see that there is an initiative to help other Black communities and other communities that have fallen on hard times, and it's that's really cool, but it still doesn't, stop the actual Western imperialist machine that Killmonger was actively talking about before. So it's really like a band-aid on a bullet hole. But that's as much as these narratives can do, otherwise it'd be too uncomfortable for the average American viewer to watch these films. And the idea of ending Western imperialism is very leftist, and that scares a lot of people who are not leftists. So as much as I liked both Black Panther movies, because I think they're probably some of the best films that the MCU has, and very creative and present this very beautiful world, you have this moment where it's oh, this is as left as they can get, because they still have to cater to, an audience of people who are comfortable with American dominance in the world. So that leads to the MCU doing this song and dance where a couple of villains who have deeper motivation or speak to a societal issue may say something about changing the status quo, possibly improving society somewhat, and then stomp out a baby or something so that we don't root for them. That's how we got Tim Pool talking about how Thanos wants to kill half of the population. Whenever a guy who actually reads or is knowledgeable about the world ends up talking about how there should be some kind of resource redistribution.
Something you won't like to hear, though.
I'm willing to sully myself if that's the outcome.
But I'll tell you something you're not going to want to hear, and I admit it's I'll call it dickish. Utilitarianism is typically the villain in most movies.
I don't care.
Yeah. So for instance, Thanos was utilitarian, and Captain America was deontological.
I didn't.
So Thanos willing to reduce the suffering by killing hundreds of trillions versus the thousands of trillions which would be living better off. So,
but I'm not
comic book movies.
I'm not having to kill anybody.
When originally Thanos was just an incel who wanted to hook up with the personification of death. The better motivation, I will argue on my deathbed for that. Now we have The Boys being of the superhero genre, even as a subversion. I think what made people think it was going to be protecting the status quo is that we have mentions of the military in the show itself, The Boys being a version of the CIA. But I think what people kind of didn't recognize is that because it's not owned by Disney or Warner Brothers, and even though it's owned by Amazon Prime Studio, they are given a lot more freedom to push the envelope. So we have these moments where they're able to call out capitalism a lot more, but is still a product of capitalism itself as being an Amazon Prime show. This also isn't to say that every single action movie or action TV show is inherently conservative, only that because these films have to be commercial enterprises, there's a lot of pressure on filmmakers to make things that are crowd-pleasing, and sometimes that means giving into the centrism and not going too far into leftist ideas or radicalism to make sure that the most amount of people possible will watch the show or movie, so that you hit that middle of the road that presumably gets the most people watching, because America has a mix of people who range from conservatives to leftists, and you want to hit the most people who are in between. And sometimes some filmmakers are just conservative or have conservative ideas that come out in their films, and some filmmakers are leftists with leftist ideas, and it all just, it varies. So it's not that the action genre is inherently more conservative because filmmakers are evil. It's just that films are commercial enterprises, so they have to make a decent amount of money. They have to make a return on investment and make the oodles and boodles back. And with that, you have to hit that audience. It's very complicated. Just that the action genre has been a tool to reinforce certain ideas. That doesn't mean that it is inherent to that genre, that genre is inherently bad. In conclusion, I understood perfectly why conservatives loved The Boys for so long, when the idea of vulgarity, saying it like it is, and action have been so tied to the status quo of normalizing American conservatism and ideas from that political alignment of show. Of course, you're going to assume that a show that engages in vulgarity and extreme action is courting you as an audience. There's also a point where people think that, hey, they had their poster boy Homelander support a literal Nazi. Why didn't that raise any alarm bells? And it's because the average conservative doesn't think they are a Nazi unless they call themselves that up front. And those that are hide behind dog whistles, so it's easy to be like, hey, that's not me. I agree with some of her points that I would never be a Nazi like Stormfront. Only for the show to go, no, I do in fact mean that you, a conservative, suck ass, even if you don't label yourself a Nazi. If you engage in fascistic behavior, you are a fascist. To the point within less of a week of The Boys doing storyline about a conservative internet personality being a child groomer was revealed to the public, and the conservative public still supported her while claiming her progressive counterpart was a child groomer instead, was rallied in real time with a conservative internet personality being a child groomer, while his conservative audience and his supporters still defend him, yet call trans people as a collective child groomers just for existing. Like, this is as close to, life reflecting life as it could be. Lastly, I want to point out that no media is going to save us as leftists, and it's not like actual activism. You can kind of talk about the messages in media and use that to push people left or right or whatever, and you can make art to inspire people. What is important is putting those politics into action and choosing to help people and being more active in your community in any way that you can be. I hope that if you are conservative, you grow out of that and learn to change and grow as a person and have compassion for your fellow man and do the necessary hard work to make up to the people you may have harmed in your journey of conservatism. The ideology of conservatism means that you have to be a very strict and narrow version of yourself in order to be loved within the conservative community. And if you can't keep up, then you're out. And that's rough. These are my ads. You can follow me on Twitter and TikTok if you want, or not. I don't really care that much. I also have a link in the description to help some Palestinian, Congolese, and Sudanese charities. I would be super grateful if any of you guys can donate to that. Let's put some of that, political thinking into action. Thank you.